In 1990, Madonna was selling out arenas on the Blonde Ambition World Tour, pulling in over $60 million while churches called her a threat and cities tried to shut her down. She was the most watched, most attacked woman in pop culture. But how many people knew that behind the control and controversy was a child who lost her mother at 5 and never felt safe again? Most people think it was luck. It wasn't. This is how Madonna went from a grieving, broke girl in New York to the woman who rewrote power, fame, and survival. Before the world saw Madonna as untouchable, New York almost erased her. In the late 1970s, she arrived in the city with barely any money and no safety net. She slept on friends' floors. She carried her clothes in bags. One night, not long after she arrived, she was held at knife point and robbed. Another night, she would later admit, she was sexually assaulted. No headlines. No sympathy. Just a lesson burned into her nervous system. No one was coming to save her. By the early 1980s, success came fast. Too fast. In 1984, Like a Virgin turned her into a global star almost overnight. MTV played her nonstop. Within a few years, she was selling millions of records, dominating charts across continents, and filling arenas that had never seen a female artist command that kind of power alone. But the higher she rose, the harder the backlash hit. By 1989, Pepsi pulled a $5 million campaign after religious groups erupted over Like a Prayer. In 1990, the Blonde Ambition World Tour sparked protests outside venues before she even stepped on stage. Cities debated banning her shows. Priests told followers not to attend. Parents warned their daughters not to become her. And yet, every night, the arenas were full. What looked like provocation was survival. Control was not vanity. It was armor. Madonna learned early that visibility without power is dangerous. So she took both. On stage, she was fearless. Off stage, she trusted almost no one. Fame didn't heal the wound. It widened it. And the world had no idea how close she always felt to falling back into silence. Madonna was born in 1958 in Bay City, Michigan, into a strict Catholic family. She was the third of 6 children. Her father worked hard, believed in discipline, and expected obedience. Her mother was gentle, deeply religious, and the emotional center of the household. For the first 5 years of her life, Madonna experienced something close to stability. Then, in 1963, her mother died of breast cancer. No long goodbye. No clear explanation. She was 5 years old, and the world she understood simply vanished. No one sat her down and explained what death meant. No one helped her process the loss. The adults around her moved forward because they had to. The house filled with silence where her mother's presence used to be. For a child, that silence felt like abandonment. Madonna later said she felt angry, confused, and terrified. Not just sad. Terrified. From that point on, safety stopped feeling permanent. Her father remarried not long after. The household changed again. New rules. New emotional boundaries. Madonna did not feel comforted by religion, even though it surrounded her. Instead, she felt watched, judged, and restrained. She learned early that expressing emotion did not bring relief. It brought correction. So she internalized everything. Pain went inward. Control became the only way to survive. At school, she stood out. She was outspoken, defiant, and unwilling to blend in. Teachers noticed her intelligence but also her refusal to be passive. Other kids saw her as different. She felt it. That sense of being separate, of not fully belonging, followed her everywhere. But it also sharpened her. She learned how to rely on herself. She learned how to perform strength even when she didn't feel it. Dance became her escape. Movement gave her something words never could. It gave her control over her body in a world where so much had been taken without permission. When she danced, she wasn't waiting to be chosen. She was deciding. That distinction mattered. It became a pattern she would repeat for the rest of her life. She left Michigan to attend the University of Michigan on a dance scholarship. It was the first time she stepped away from her family completely. For a moment, it looked like a conventional path forward. Education. Structure. Approval. Then she walked away. Not because she lacked talent, but because staying felt like suffocation. She chose uncertainty over quiet resentment. When she moved to New York City in the late 1970s, she arrived with little money and no protection. She lived on friends' floors. She missed meals. She carried everything she owned in bags. The city was brutal and indifferent. At one point, she was robbed at knife point. She later revealed that she was sexually assaulted. Again, no safety net. Again, no rescue. Just another confirmation of a belief already wired deep inside her: if she wanted to survive, she had to stay alert, in control, and ahead of everyone else. These early years did not make her fearless. They made her vigilant. The loss of her mother taught her that love could disappear without warning. The instability that followed taught her that dependence was dangerous. By the time fame entered her life, the emotional foundation was already set. She did not crave attention for validation. She craved it because invisibility felt lethal. This context matters. Without it, Madonna looks provocative for the sake of rebellion. With it, her behavior tells a different story. A child who learned too early that softness leads to loss. A teenager who learned that compliance brings erasure. A young woman who decided that power, even if it came at a cost, was better than disappearing quietly. By the time she stepped onto a stage for the first time, she was not chasing applause. She was chasing permanence. And she would spend the rest of her life trying to outrun the moment everything she loved disappeared. When Madonna left Michigan for New York City in 1978, she did not arrive with a plan B. She arrived with discipline, instinct, and the belief that hesitation would kill momentum. The city was not waiting for her. It was crowded with talent, ambition, and people just as desperate to be seen. She was not special yet. She was replaceable. And she knew it. She took dance classes wherever she could afford them. Sometimes she couldn't. She trained anyway. She joined small bands. She played drums. She sang backup. She watched how men ran rehearsals, how power moved in rooms, and how easily women were dismissed. When doors didn't open, she pushed harder. When she was ignored, she made herself louder. Not emotionally louder. Strategically louder. Money was always tight. She took modeling jobs she didn't enjoy. She accepted roles that barely paid. She learned fast which situations were unsafe and which ones were simply uncomfortable. That line mattered. She didn't romanticize struggle. She endured it. Each rejection reinforced the same lesson she learned as a child: waiting to be rescued was a mistake. Her first real break did not come from being chosen by an executive. It came from choosing herself. She began writing her own songs. She didn't just want to perform. She wanted authorship, control, direction. In an industry that expected young women to fit into existing molds, that decision alone made her difficult. Early recordings were rough. Early performances were uneven. Critics were not kind. Some dismissed her voice. Others saw her as a dancer pretending to be a singer. She listened, but she did not obey. Instead, she refined the one thing she knew was undeniable: presence. She understood rhythm. She understood image. She understood how attention works, and more importantly, how fast it disappears if you don't command it. By the early 1980s, she signed her first record deal. It was not a coronation. It was a test. She pushed back on producers. She argued over arrangements. She insisted on being involved in decisions that most new artists were told to stay out of. This made her difficult again. It also made her dangerous. Her first hits didn't come from perfection. They came from clarity. She knew exactly who she was not willing to be. She would not be silent. She would not be managed into submission. And she would not let anyone else define her limits. Every step forward came with resistance. But resistance had been part of her life long before music. Compared to loss, hunger, and fear, rejection was survivable. By the time mainstream success arrived, the foundation was already built. She had learned how to stand alone. And in an industry that thrives on dependency, that was the beginning of real power. By the mid-1980s, Madonna was no longer chasing relevance. She had it. In 1984, a single performance changed everything. Lace gloves. A wedding dress. A body rolling across the stage. Overnight, she became unavoidable. MTV played her videos on rotation. Radio followed. Record stores couldn't keep up. Within a year, her music was everywhere, and so was the argument about her. Albums sold in the millions. Tours sold out. She wasn't just successful. She was polarizing. Parents complained. Churches protested. Critics argued whether she had talent or just nerve. None of that slowed her down. If anything, it sharpened her instinct. Attention was currency, and she learned how to spend it better than anyone else. What made her rise different was not just the speed, but the control. She didn't wait for permission to define her image. She curated it. She shifted personas deliberately. One era ended, another began. Each transformation felt calculated, not reactive. She understood something most artists didn't at the time: the public doesn't just consume music. They consume narrative. By the late 1980s, she was no longer competing with other female artists. She was competing with the culture itself. Fashion followed her. Dance followed her. Pop stars who came after studied her like a blueprint. She turned concerts into theater, videos into short films, tours into statements. But success did not bring relief. It brought scrutiny. Every move was dissected. Every relationship became public property. Every decision was treated like a provocation. The same media that amplified her now waited for a misstep. She felt it. The margin for error shrank as the spotlight grew. In 1989, that tension exploded. Like a prayer, blurred the line between faith and rebellion. Religious imagery collided with sexuality. Protests followed. Sponsors backed out. A major advertising deal collapsed under pressure. To many artists, that would have been a warning. To her, it was confirmation. The message was clear: power only matters if you're willing to use it. In 1990, she took the stage again, this time on a scale pop hadn't seen before. The Blonde Ambition World Tour was not just a concert series. It was a confrontation. Choreography, storytelling, costumes, and themes pushed boundaries nightly. Outside venues, protesters gathered. Inside, crowds erupted. Some cities debated canceling shows. Others issued warnings. None of it stopped the tour. The numbers spoke louder. Over $60 million grossed. Night after night, sold-out arenas. From the outside, it looked like victory. But internally, the cost was rising. Control became tighter. Trust became rarer. She surrounded herself with professionals, not confidants. The schedule was relentless. The expectations were endless. Success had turned into a machine that never powered down. She had achieved what she set out to do. She was visible, unignorable, permanent. And yet, the original fear never left. The fear of being erased. The fear that if she stopped moving, the silence would return. By the early 1990s, Madonna stood at the top of pop culture with no equals. But the higher she climbed, the more isolated the view became. Fame had delivered power, but it had not delivered peace. And the world, hungry for the next collapse, began to watch more closely than ever. By the early 1990s, Madonna had reached a level of fame where nothing about her life belonged entirely to her anymore. Every choice became a headline. Every silence became suspicion. The public no longer asked what she created. They asked what she would do next to provoke them. The pressure was constant, but it was not new. What was new was the scale. She wasn't just being criticized. She was being monitored. Religious groups labeled her dangerous. Politicians referenced her name as a symbol of cultural decay. Media narratives stopped treating her as an artist and started treating her as a problem to be solved. Inside that storm, Madonna tightened control even further. Schedules were rigid. Rehearsals were brutal. Mistakes were not tolerated. Not because she was cruel, but because chaos felt unsafe. Control was the only thing that kept the fear quiet. The same fear she had carried since childhood. The fear that if she let go, everything would collapse. Relationships suffered first. Romantic partners came into a world where privacy didn't exist and emotional softness wasn't rewarded. She demanded loyalty, discipline, and strength. Few people could meet those expectations. Many left. Each departure reinforced her belief that attachment was temporary. By 1992, the tension reached its peak. That year, Madonna released the book Sex alongside the album Erotica. The response was immediate and vicious. The book sold over 1 million copies almost instantly, but the backlash was louder than the numbers. Countries restricted its release. Talk shows ridiculed her. Commentators announced that she had crossed an irreversible line. What looked like provocation was something more complicated. Madonna wasn't escalating for shock value alone. She was forcing control over how she was seen. If she was going to be objectified, she would choose the frame. If she was going to be judged, she would decide the terms. To her, that was survival. But survival has a cost. Behind closed doors, exhaustion set in. The armor grew heavy. She was always performing, even when the cameras were off. Trusting someone meant risking being misunderstood, misquoted, or betrayed. So she relied on work. On repetition. On discipline. Sleep became irregular. Intimacy became distant. She was surrounded by people but rarely felt accompanied. Fame had not healed the wound of loss. It had amplified it. The louder the world became, the harder it was to hear herself think. Critics accused her of being empty. Of using controversy to mask a lack of depth. What they couldn't see was the opposite. Everything she did was overdetermined. Nothing was casual. Even pleasure felt scheduled. Even rebellion felt structured. The public began to tire. Some fans drifted away. The media sharpened its knives. Success, once a shield, started to feel like exposure. And for the first time, Madonna faced a dangerous question she had avoided her entire life. What happens if the noise stops? Because silence, to her, wasn't peace. Silence was the moment after her mother died. Silence was absence. Silence was erasure. This was the beginning of the collapse phase. Not a dramatic fall yet. Not a public breakdown. But an internal fracture. The kind that forms slowly, invisibly, until the structure can no longer hold the weight placed on it. As the backlash grew, Madonna began to feel something unfamiliar. Not fear of failure, but fatigue from resistance. For years, opposition had fueled her. Now it drained her. Every interview turned into a defense. Every appearance became a trial. The world no longer wanted to understand her. It wanted resolution. An ending. Inside, the cracks widened. She questioned her own instincts. Not publicly, never on stage, but in the quiet moments when the day finally stopped. She had built her life around movement and control, yet her body and mind were signaling overload. The pace that once kept her safe was now pushing her toward collapse. She withdrew emotionally, even as her visibility remained absolute. Friends noticed distance. Collaborators noticed tension. The discipline that once felt empowering hardened into rigidity. Joy became harder to access. Work continued because stopping felt dangerous, but the meaning behind it blurred. The early 1990s marked a shift in how the public engaged with her. Where fascination once dominated, suspicion took over. The same press that celebrated her reinvention now framed her as desperate. Aging became a weapon. Sexuality became evidence against her. She felt the rules change mid-game, but she had no intention of stepping aside. Privately, loneliness deepened. Trust required vulnerability, and vulnerability felt like exposure. Exposure had always led to pain. So she stayed guarded. She managed her environment tightly, but no amount of control could quiet the deeper question forming underneath everything she did. Who was she without the performance? That question terrified her. Because performance had been her shield since childhood. It was how she survived loss, danger, and invisibility. Without it, she feared the old silence would return. The silence she associated with abandonment. With being left behind. There were moments when the mask slipped. Brief admissions of exhaustion. Glimpses of doubt. But the world was not patient with complexity. It wanted a narrative it could digest. Rise. Shock. Fall. Madonna refused to cooperate, but the pressure to break her increased. By the mid-1990s, she recognized the pattern clearly. The harder she pushed against the expectations placed on her, the more isolated she became. Not because she was wrong, but because the space at the top had no room for rest. She had won the fight for control, but lost access to softness along the way. This period did not end with a public meltdown or a dramatic collapse. It ended with something quieter and more dangerous. Emotional numbness. A sense of being disconnected from the very identity she fought so hard to protect. Success had become survival, not fulfillment. For the first time, Madonna faced the possibility that power alone was not enough. That visibility without healing only multiplies wounds. That control, when carried too far, turns into a prison built from discipline and fear. This realization did not save her immediately. But it planted the seed for what came next. A pause. A recalibration. A slow and painful recognition that the armor she forged to survive might now be preventing her from living. The world still watched. The noise never fully stopped. But inside, a shift had begun. The collapse had not destroyed her. It had cornered her. And for the first time since she was 5 years old, she was being forced to confront the fear she had spent her entire life outrunning. The turning point did not arrive with applause. It arrived with exhaustion. By the mid-1990s, Madonna had nothing left to prove to the world. She had survived the backlash. She had outlasted predictions of her downfall. Yet internally, something was unsustainable. The constant tension. The emotional distance. The need to stay armored at all times. For the first time, she began to recognize that survival mode was no longer serving her. It was consuming her. The shift started quietly. Not with a reinvention for headlines, but with a re-evaluation of how she was living. She slowed down. Not completely, but enough to listen. The noise that once drowned out discomfort was no longer there to protect her. And in that quieter space, old grief resurfaced. The loss of her mother. The fear of abandonment. The belief that softness equaled danger. She did not abandon control. She redefined it. Instead of fighting every narrative, she chose her battles. Instead of reacting to outrage, she focused on craft. Training became about longevity, not punishment. Discipline shifted from domination to sustainability. It was a subtle change, but a critical one. Power no longer meant resistance at all costs. It meant knowing when to step back. Creatively, this period marked a recalibration. She leaned into restraint. Precision replaced provocation. Emotion surfaced without needing shock as a delivery system. The work became less about confrontation and more about clarity. For an artist who had spent years pushing outward, this inward turn was unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Personal life followed the same pattern. She guarded her privacy more carefully. She began drawing firmer boundaries around access, not to isolate herself further, but to protect what little emotional space she had left. Trust was still difficult, but no longer impossible. She learned, slowly, that vulnerability did not always lead to loss. Motherhood would later deepen this shift, but even before that, the groundwork was being laid. Madonna started confronting the idea that being visible did not have to mean being exposed. That strength did not require constant aggression. That survival did not have to feel like war. This was not a dramatic redemption arc. There was no single moment where everything changed. It was a series of choices made against old instincts. Choices to rest when she wanted to push. To listen when she wanted to control. To stay present instead of performing strength. The most difficult change was internal. Letting go of the belief that she had to earn her right to exist through constant output. For decades, she had equated stillness with danger. Now, she was learning to tolerate it. To sit with discomfort without immediately turning it into movement or noise. This period marked the first time Madonna began to separate who she was from what she produced. The distinction was fragile, but transformative. Without it, everything remained transactional. With it, she could begin to heal. The world continued to debate her relevance. That debate mattered less than it once did. Her value was no longer dependent on being the loudest voice in the room. She had already survived that test. The real challenge now was learning how to live without armor. This was the beginning of rebirth. Not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that integrates it. The trauma did not disappear. The fear did not vanish. But they stopped running the entire system. Madonna was no longer just outrunning erasure. She was learning how to stay. By the late 1990s, Madonna's relationship with fame had changed. She no longer needed to dominate every cycle to exist within it. The urgency that once drove her to constant reinvention softened into something more deliberate. She still worked relentlessly, but the work now served a longer horizon. Longevity mattered more than disruption. Public perception lagged behind that shift. Many critics framed her quieter phases as decline. Fewer scandals meant less coverage. Fewer confrontations meant fewer headlines. But this misread the moment. Madonna was not retreating. She was consolidating. She had already won the cultural battle she entered years earlier. Now she was shaping what came after. Her influence became easier to see when she stopped shouting. Younger artists adopted her playbook without naming it. Control over image. Ownership of narrative. Touring as theater. Music videos as statements. Fashion as language. What once felt controversial had become standard. The industry had moved, almost imperceptibly, to where she had stood alone years earlier. Legacy, however, is not built only on innovation. It is built on permission. Madonna gave permission to women to be contradictory. To be ambitious without apology. To be sexual without surrendering authorship. To age publicly without disappearing. In the 1980s and 1990s, that kind of permission did not exist at scale. She forced it into existence by refusing to step aside. This came at a cost. The years of resistance left marks. Emotional restraint remained a default. Trust still required effort. But something fundamental had shifted. Survival was no longer her only operating mode. She had learned how to stay present without performing fearlessness at all times. Culturally, her impact extended far beyond music. She altered how power was negotiated between artists and institutions. Labels learned that control could not be assumed. Media learned that outrage did not guarantee submission. Audiences learned that discomfort could coexist with admiration. These lessons did not belong to one genre or era. They reshaped the terrain. By the time the world entered a new millennium, Madonna's place was no longer defined by charts alone. She had become a reference point, a boundary marker, a before and after figure. Artists who followed did not have to repeat her battles. They inherited the ground she cleared. What remains most striking about her later life is not the absence of controversy, but the presence of choice. She no longer had to prove permanence. She had achieved it. The fear of erasure that once dictated every move no longer held the same power. It existed, but it did not drive. Madonna's story is often summarized as provocation followed by endurance. That summary misses the deeper truth. Her real legacy lies in transformation. Not just of sound or image, but of possibility. She changed what a woman in control could look like in public, and what survival could look like in private. She did not arrive at peace easily. She earned it slowly, unevenly, and at times reluctantly. But she stayed. And staying, after everything she endured, may be her most lasting achievement. Madonna's journey is often reduced to controversy, costumes, and confrontation. That version is easy to remember. It is also incomplete. Beneath the noise was a child who learned too early that love could disappear without warning. A young woman who discovered that dependence was dangerous. An artist who chose control not to dominate others, but to protect herself from vanishing again. Her story is not about being fearless. It is about functioning while afraid. It is about building armor strong enough to survive a world that watched, judged, and waited for her to fail. And then, slowly, learning when that armor was no longer helping. Success did not save her. Fame did not heal her. Power did not erase loss. What changed her life was the moment she realized that survival could not be the end goal forever. That staying alive is not the same as living. That control without softness eventually turns inward. Madonna did not win by being liked. She won by refusing to disappear. She stayed when silence felt safer. She stayed when the world wanted an ending. And in doing so, she changed what endurance looks like. Her life leaves a quieter question behind. Not about fame. Not about rebellion. But about what you built to survive, and whether it still serves you now. So what's your story?